Hello, and welcome to HCR's webinar on crypto assets and the taxation of them. My name is Steven Murray. I'm a partner in the Dispute Resolution Department, specialising in intellectual property and the recovery of crypto assets. I'm joined today by Sarah Woodall, tax barrister, visiting lecturer at the University of London, and gamekeeper turned poacher as she now acts for taxpayers rather than at the HMRC. I'm also joined by Professor Dan Hyde, visiting professor at the University of London, who wrote the book on crypto assets and blockchain. When we talk about crypto assets, we think predominantly about cryptocurrencies. And the most familiar to those of you is going to be Bitcoin. Bitcoin came to the fore on the 1st of January 2009. Today's webinar will provide some background information and some useful ways in which to address your investments in crypto assets and to avoid any pitfalls with taxations. So to start with, Dan, could you please explain what a crypto asset is?
Crypto assets, let's first of all deal with the terminology. Crypto assets may also be called tokens or cryptocurrency, but effectively we're talking about the same thing. For today's purposes, we'll use crypto assets because it's probably the broader terminology. Essentially, they are a digital representation of, it could be value, so perhaps similar to money, or rights. So you can store, transfer, convey rights through in the form of a digital asset, if you like. There are means of representing either some sort of value or some sort of rights. They differ from what we might term fiat currency or money in the usual sense because they're not government regulated and they're not passing through a central bank.
Okay, so what type of crypto assets are you seeing?
Well, we're seeing a number. So if I just run through. So first of all, you'd have what's called an exchange token, which is probably the most similar to our concept of money in that it can be used for exchange, for bartering, for paying, for investment, for those sorts of things. Another is widely used as a utility token. It's similar to an exchange token in that it can also be used for payment, but quite often they would be issued by, say, a business or a venture, almost the way you would an old-fashioned sort of voucher.
Okay.
So that's a utility token. You can have a security token, which conveys rights. So those could be rights that you have now, often termed futures. So you're giving somebody maybe a share of something in the future. They're called a security because they're effectively creating a body of rights. Non-fungible tokens is another type of token which is slightly different to all the others I mentioned before because they are each unique. So they're non-fungible denotes the fact that each token is unique in some way to another. And we can look at perhaps the uses of those later, but they have obvious use because, for example, they can be used as a form of receipt or authentication because there aren't two of a kind.
Okay.
So you can attach them perhaps to a physical object to show that you have ownership. And because there can only be that particular NFT, non-fungible token, for that particular physical object, it's a really powerful way of denoting ownership.
So that's useful in the likes of the art world. So I've seen Damien Hirst has released the currency, which is you can either choose to have a piece of the artwork or the token that represents it.
Fantastically useful. So I think Christie's were probably the first sort of auction house to actually start selling art with NFTs. And again, as I've said, because of their uniqueness, it's a fantastic way to denote ownership. If you're paying, say, millions for a Mona Lisa, it's important that you're going to have something that actually shows, immutably that you own that piece. And the other massive advantage of an NFT is it can of itself be a work of art. So because it's unique, you can actually have images on the NFT itself. So it may not be attached to a physical work of art, but the artist, in this case, be a digital artist, is selling you an NFT. And again, those now are selling for hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds. So they're doing rather well in the art world.
Fantastic. But I suppose, like with any sort of currency or anything of value, the governments are likely to tax it. So, Sarah, could you perhaps explain whether or not HMRC sees crypto assets as money?
They don't, but that's a simple answer, which HMRC arrived at after a lot of work. In 2018, there was a joint task force between HMRC and the Bank of England looking into crypto assets. And they concluded that because of the volatility in crypto assets, which we've all seen in the press, and also the difficulties at that time with using them for transactions, you can't, for example, go to the greengrocers at the moment and use them in the way that you could cash, that they shouldn't be designated as money. But it's important to acknowledge that things are moving very quickly, and that position could ultimately change.
Right.
Whilst HMRC is very interested in crypto assets, and they are reputationally not always in a good place. We've seen in the press they can be associated with fraud and organised crime. There is no suggestion that anyone holds a crypto asset is involved in tax avoidance or tax evasion. There's nothing unlawful about it. But nonetheless, it's important to take advice in relation to the taxation of crypto assets. HMRC is monitoring and evolving its approach as time goes by. Okay. The Treasury itself has had a lot of interest, and we're seeing a lot of guidance from HMRC, for example, in stablecoin.
Okay.
And the potential for stablecoin to help us all with financial transactions and to move the equivalent of money more quickly, less expensively. And also a particular interest in distributed ledger technology and the potential for that to help the evolution of the capital markets.
Okay. So, sorry, you mentioned distributed ledger technology. Dan, I wonder if you could expand upon what that actually is.
Distributed ledger technology is essentially a form of blockchain. So most people understand or at least know what blockchain is. And distributed ledger technology, or what's often termed DLT, is effectively that. And in simple terms, it's a digital ledger. So it's a means of providing a decentralized system of information. So by decentralized, in most modern IT, when I say modern, I mean before DLT, would rely on a source that wasn't decentralized. So for example, say you ask your estate agent about how your house or property is doing. Right. You're relying on them giving you reliable information.
Yes.
That's a centralized system because your source here, the estate agent, gives you the information. What DLT does is effectively gives all the participants access to the source of information. It's said to be immutable, so that means it can't be changed and it's accurate. And what's most important for people to perhaps understand in the context of our current conversation is that it's the underlying technology for, in this case, crypto assets.
Right.
It can have other uses as well. But for example, Bitcoin, the underlying technology was blockchain, so you couldn't have one without the other. So DLT, if you like, is a facilitator for crypto assets and also for other business uses as well, because of its use in allowing people to access information that, if you like, directly.
Dan, you've simplified that really beautifully. But for the average man in the street, what steps do they take if they want to buy cryptocurrency?
It's very straightforward. It would be via what's called an exchange, which is a form of platform. So essentially you have cryptocurrency exchanges and you can buy cryptocurrency. So you can use your fiat currency, so your money, and you can use that to exchange it for cryptocurrency, or as we're calling them, crypto assets. Or the other way around, you can actually exchange one for the other. So you could give them crypto assets that you already have and they will exchange it for money, for fiat currency, or it could even be crypto for crypto. Because you have different types of crypto asset, you could exchange one for another. There are platforms called exchanges. You would enter into a contract with them. You would make arrangements with them, and it's a relatively straightforward process.
So once you've got cryptocurrency, how do you store it? How do you use it?
So once you have your cryptocurrency, you would need keys. So you'd have public and private keys and a wallet to store those keys in. There's a common misconception is that cryptocurrency is stored in a wallet, the same way you might have a wallet with money and with notes in. In the cryptocurrency world, that's not the case. The wallet stores the keys.
Right.
And effectively, I think the easiest way to explain keys is you have a public key and a private key. Your public key is akin to, I guess, your bank account. So if you think about your bank account, you'd have, your account number and your sort code. That's kind of your public key. So the reason it's public is it's not fatal. You can give that out to people, and you'd have to, for example, if you wanted money to come into your account. The private key, I think a good analogy would be your PIN number, which you perhaps wouldn't want to give out, or some other perhaps password that enables, because it's the private key together with the public key that enables access, so that with those two, you can pay out, using your crypto assets.
Right.
The reason there are two keys, it's just because of what we call cryptographic asymmetry. So essentially, there's a mathematical correlation. So when they're created, the public key is created, and then the private key is sort of born out of the public key. So you actually need both of them together in order to be able to access, in this case, your cryptocurrency, your crypto asset. They are stored in the wallet, which effectively keeps them safe.
So I've heard about hot and cold wallets. What's the difference?
A hot wallet is essentially a wallet that can be accessed online, so it's internet accessible. A cold wallet would be paper or some other form of non-online, non-internet storage.
I see.
There's a debate as to whether one is more secure than the other.
That's really clear. But I mean, we're all seeing in the press lots of news around crypto assets, and it's largely around risk and things going wrong for people. What have you seen in practice in the cases that you're working as evidence of abuse?
More recently, there's been a lot of activity where we've seen companies set themselves up as fraudulent companies and encouraging people to invest in cryptocurrency as a way of siphoning off their hard-earned money. I'm acting with a client at the moment who was encouraged to invest in cryptocurrency by an advert that he saw on Facebook. He was invited to provide his wallets, as Dan was just talking about, and both the private and the public keys. They were able to then assist him, in quotation marks, in transferring his cryptocurrency into an asset of theirs. He thought he was investing in other currencies and trading one off the other in a way of making money. But what actually happened is they transferred his cryptocurrency into a wallet of theirs and presented him with a website that made it look like his investments were actually making money. In the meantime, his cryptocurrency had disappeared.
Yeah, gosh. Steve, this is going to be pretty terrifying for people when it happens to them. What are the key risks that you're seeing?
It's a lack of knowledge, really. People are going into this not understanding what the risks are. Hopefully, part of this webinar will leave people with some tools to go ahead and invest more safely. But because of the way in which companies can hide themselves, it can be incredibly risky. The client I mentioned before, we researched a company. It was registered at Companies House, as you'd expect. But then we noted that the director was based in St. Vincent's and the Grenadines. We then needed to find out how those assets had been moved. We employed a crypto assets investigation team called Ciro, and they were able to trace the Bitcoin as it traveled through all the different wallets. And now we've identified the wallet those monies were transferred to. It's a clear collection of different wallets, which are protected by their keys. The next step we're going to have to is write to the owners of those exchanges, where those wallets sit, in order to find out who actually is behind it, because our trace through Companies House led us to pretty much a dead end. We wrote to one of them and made a data subject access request to find out who had opened up the wallet with them. And because of the legislation under GDPR, we were able to get that information. And we found out that the person who opened it was based in Bulgaria. Further research took us to identify that actually this whole fraud was underwritten by organised crime in the Eastern Bloc.
You've described, as a result of all of that work, that you've managed to find the wallet where these crypto assets are now being held.
Yes.
What happens next?
Well, now we have to try and freeze them. For that, we're going to have to apply to court for a freezing injunction. Part of the application will also request that the owners of those wallets disclose more information as to the whereabouts of the people who own them. And this process isn't cheap. So far, the client spent about £60,000 to pursue these assets. But given that the Bitcoins involved are worth somewhere in the region of 4.3 million, that investment is worthwhile. But it's important to do the investigation first, identify where the assets are likely to be, and then we can convince the court that those wallets have been used as an instrument of fraud. So that when the freezing injunction applies, the hope is that the courts will agree our argument that because it has been used as an instrument of fraud, whatever's in the wallet at that point in time can be transmitted to our client. So we don't have to follow the chain all the way to the end, but rather, once we've identified those wallets, take what's in there on the basis that what has been in there was ours and shouldn't have been there in the first place. So my client was obviously taking a bit of a gamble when he invested in crypto assets. Does HMRC see that exchange as gambling?
For taxation purposes, no. When you talk about risk, the whole area is perceived as pregnant with risk. But in terms of whether or not it's characterized for tax purposes as gambling, the answer is no. But that's a general answer. And certain transactions, depending on their characteristics, may in certain circumstances be regarded as gambling by HMRC. And generally, those are those transactions where the client has little or no control, makes no informed decision. But the taxation consequences of that really are quite profound. In general terms, as I said, it's not regarded as gambling by HMRC, and you're going to be liable to tax on it. So we've talked about the secrecy of cryptocurrencies, the way in which assets don't exist in a tangible form. That doesn't mean that HMRC aren't aware of them. It doesn't mean that HMRC aren't interested in them. Quite the contrary. For the general man in the street or woman in the street, transactions in cryptocurrencies are going to be liable to capital gains tax. And you should take that into consideration in any transactions or decision making that you enter into. And that means that the gains will be liable to capital gains tax, and any losses arising will be available to set off other capital gains. When it comes to business, if you or I as individuals trade in cryptocurrencies, we need to be thinking about capital gains tax. However, if our employer was to give us some crypto assets, perhaps at Christmas,
nice.
Easter, great idea, that would be regarded as an emolument of the office or employment. So then we're starting to think about, okay, income tax in much the same way as would anything else that you receive from your employer, and therefore potentially liable to income tax, national insurance contribution. In relation to business, if you're trading in crypto assets or if you're mining, then you are trading in the ordinary way. So if you're a limited company, you can potentially be liable to corporation tax. If you're a sole trader, income tax. And there is also potential for capital gains tax in that arena too. So it's going to depend very much on the characteristics of an individual and the transactions they're entering into. Conversely, if it's a business, is it a corporate entity, non-corporate entity? What are they doing? That will inform the decision that HMRC will take as to how transactions are going to be taxed. But one thing is sure, is that this is not a magic answer to the difficulty of taxation. This is not a device or an opportunity not to pay tax. Quite the contrary. HMRC are all over the piece. It's important to be aware of risks for that reason. Nobody wants to get stuck with penalties for deliberate misconduct, up to 70%, in some cases worse if it's fraud. Do be aware, HMRC is interested, and take advice if you need it. Don't think that these transactions are free of tax. And if you take a decision not to disclose to HMRC, be aware that's a very risky choice to take.
So I've had the misfortune of having to fill in a tax return myself. And I can remember it being very difficult to try and keep track of everything. Have you got any tips or tricks about the type of records that HMRC might be interested in when it comes to crypto assets?
I think the one risk with crypto assets is it's all very exciting. Things move very quickly. We've seen very significant fluctuations in values. We do see clients who are involved in very many transactions over very short periods of time, some of them making very significant amounts of profit, others not having such a good time. But when it comes to taxation, the fact that you've been involved in high pressure, multiple transactions, in a volatile market makes no difference. You need to have kept the records. HMRC will not regard it as a reasonable excuse that you were busy or this was stressful. You need to keep a record of every transaction. So that's the date of the transaction, the nature of the transaction, what was in your wallet, what have you exchanged, what have you bought. Make sure that you have access to those wallets. Dan's described hot wallets, which are those virtual wallets, things that are kept on the internet, and also hard wallets, so bits of paper. We see clients using USB sticks. Some cases I've seen, people have found it more difficult to find stuff when it's modern and it's hot, and it's on the internet, than had they just printed it out. Make sure that you keep everything, and make sure you keep it in such a way that you are confident with your skills you can access it. So if you're not particularly techy, you might want to keep hard copy stuff, hard wallets. And if you're keeping stuff in a hot style, be confident that you can be able to access it. Don't change laptop and leave, your personal key on a laptop. We see horror stories in the press. Although it's a very new and exciting innovation, the whole crypto asset world, really go back to basics. And the basics are, you need to be able to satisfy HMRC what was going on, when it was going on, and the amounts involved at every stage. Think hard and just take care
Understood. But given the cryptocurrencies and those assets are based on the blockchain, surely the blockchain is always immutable. So would you not be able to refer back to those transactions?
Yes, you should. I mean, it's often being held up as one of the great advantages of a blockchain, that it's immutable and you can look back and you have an audit trail. I still take the point that you should have, backup information, because nothing's infallible. In principle, at least, the blockchain is a great source of information that can't be altered.
So, of course, there's always going to be times when people get it wrong. Have you come across any horror stories?
We've definitely come across stories that we probably wouldn't have seen in the past in tax. So we've seen people in their late teens, early 20s, early uptakers, very interested in what's gone on, made some very successful investments, and very unsuccessfully forgotten to think about the tax implications. Some of them had never actually been taxpayers before.
Really?
The worst possible thing is you have a great idea, you're brave, you're an early uptaker, you're very successful, you manage to make a great deal of money, and then you fall foul of HMRC. And actually, some of these stories are really quite sad. Be aware, it's not so new that HMRC aren't aware of it. It's not so new that it isn't liable to tax. The law that we're using in the context of crypto assets is exactly the same law as we're using for any other area of finance. Young people who are being penalised 70% simply because they knew nothing about HMRC, they knew nothing about taxation. In some respects, it's really quite sad. So keep on top of it. Be aware of your obligations. Enjoy your successes, but do take those obligations into account when deciding when to sell, what you're going to sell, and also, when you're investing.
Yeah. What type of stumbling blocks have your clients come across?
Well, Stephen, the main stumbling block my clients come across has a big R, and that's the R of regulation. It's often, whether I'm dealing with entrepreneurs who are launching new ventures using blockchain or crypto assets, or whether it's an established company that are adding new capabilities and weaving in new technology, what they often overlook is that these things are regulated. So the common perception is that if it's crypto, it's beyond regulation, but that's not the case. And the reason it's not the case is often the business and all the moving parts that are built around it often require regulation by the Financial Conduct Authority. So effectively, that's a stumbling block. I mean, if you're an entrepreneur looking to launch some sort of sexy, profitable business, sadly for us, lawyers aren't always at the forefront of your mind as to who you want to give your money on. So you put your idea together and you build it, and then you realize perhaps at the end, or rather too late, that it falls foul of regulation. So perhaps you need to be regulated by the FCA, Financial Conduct Authority. So a classic example of that would be in the world of financial promotion. You have a business, and in order to promote that business, you talk it up. You say, you can invest with us, or we're a pathway to glory, so on and so forth. There's quite strict rules about what you can and can't do in the realm of financial promotion if you're not regulated.
Understood.
So often businesses are hit with a letter from the FCA that basically says, you're not regulated. Can you please tell us your total receipts to date? Because these are illicit proceeds of crime. They can't be retained by you, otherwise you're committing ongoing offences. So we talked about exchanges and platforms earlier as to how you would buy and sell and exchange crypto assets. That's another classic example. If you're operating one of those, or a wallet, if you're a wallet custodian, you have to register with the FCA again. Once again, if you don't register and you're deemed to be dabbling in that arena, bang, you're going to get a notice from the FCA saying, money laundering, you should have been with us at the outset. You're not on our list of crypto asset businesses. So those are a couple of examples, but effectively the entrepreneur has to sit down and say, okay, I've got a great business idea that is going to succeed, but I need to give Harrison Clark Rickaby's a ring, because I'm going to end up in trouble otherwise from HMRC and the FCA and probably everybody else.
Prevention better than cure.
Absolutely.
So in order to wrap up, I'd like to ask both of you, in your respective fields, taxation and regulatory, what the future holds.
Well, a small but significant proportion of those people we're seeing who've invested in crypto assets have got it wrong when it comes to making appropriate declarations to tax. As public awareness of crypto assets, their risks, their opportunities grows, we're likely to see increased investment in these areas, in my opinion. it's likely that HMRC will respond by trying to help people. I wouldn't be surprised if tax returns, perhaps from as early as April 2022, start asking explicitly about crypto assets. Not much information required at all. If you just cross it, no, there hasn't been any trading in crypto assets. But that would be a sensible next step, in my opinion. HMRC is aware of the risk. It would help people who've traded and not thought about the tax implications to get it right. And it's a relatively inexpensive way for the state to help. Where people are unsure, they should take advice. But working together, I think we will see less risk in this area, and hopefully more people will start getting it right first time.
Fingers crossed. Dan?
Yeah, I think the future's bright, Stephen. Einstein once said that in order to solve old problems, we're going to have to find new ways of thinking. And to me, blockchain in particular is a new way of thinking. So the difficulty has always been that tech and ideas are always ahead of the law. So the law kind of drags behind.
Always playing catch up.
It's always playing catch up. In my world, which is the world of regulation, it is reaching the point where now you can launch a venture and you can find a way through. So I think it's a bright future. I mean, when I look at the sort of businesses I work with, it's industry agnostic. Every sector can benefit from this sort of new emerging tech, and it is doing so. I don't think there's any way back. I think technology is all about evolution, and you can't stop it, and the regulation is having to catch up. So for me, I think it's a positive outcome on the horizon.
That's all we have time for today. So I'd like to say thank you both to Sarah and Dan for your input today. Hopefully it's given our viewers something to think about, identifying the risks and opportunities that you have in dealing with crypto assets. And if you've got any questions, please get in touch.